As of today, on the 26th of July, I can say happy publication day to the book that I'm going to be talking about here in this video. I requested this book from MacLehose Press, part of the Quercus Books group, to review before it came out, as the premise really captured my imagination. And it was something that I was kind of fascinated to see how it would be executed. So the lovely people there sent me a copy of The Tree of the Toraja by Philippe Claudel. And when I first received this, I was blown away by the cover. The colours of it are just absolutely perfect. And it's just a really lovely image. It's part of the MacLehose Press Read the World series, and this is the latest one. And I'm absolutely keen to now get to read all the other names in this series, as this one, well, it blew me away. This book is a really interesting take on the pontification of life and death. The Tree of the Toraja is an homage to the reference that kind of compels the narrator of this book to discuss everything that he then goes on to discuss. The Toraja people in Indonesia are a group that kind of live with death all around them. It can take months or years before they bury their dead. And in this reference particularly, it represents the young children who die too young and are buried within trees that grow around them and grow upwards towards heaven. This is the starting point of our story, and we are taken on a journey as the narrator, whose closest friend has recently been diagnosed with and passed away with cancer, just kind of figures out his place in the world, the role of death in our everyday lives, and how, as a taboo subject in Western societies, we kind of learn how to deal or not deal with the death of those around us. Now, to say that this story is really a narrative piece doesn't quite do it justice. There is an order to the way that our narrator kind of moves through the story, but it's not linear, and it doesn't follow a particular arc or a particular journey. It's more an expression of thought. It's more like a treatise on the everyday existentialism that we kind of are confronted with. It is translated from French, and I would say that this book is definitely like French in its kind of writing style. The author himself is a lecturer, a filmmaker, and a writer, and you can tell that this story is very much a part of the author himself. For me, it was just a very touching and a very poignant piece of prose that really spoke to kind of like my soul in a way, and I didn't mind it not having a complete story. I didn't mind it not having that narrative that you are oftentimes so used to, because in a way it was like a work of art or a film, as it kind of is talked about in here. Since the author is a filmmaker, there are lots of references to the art of filmmaking and the craft of filmmaking. The narrator is a filmmaker also, and I guess one of the plots of this book, if you can even call it a plot, is that the filmmaker is working on a new film, and he is going through the process of getting it written and then produced. And I think that just gives it a greater sense of its place in the world and the place within our lives, and the way that we kind of consume media. Any fan of Susan Sontag would also be a fan of this. So the writing style of this piece, it is told in first person by the narrator as he tries to understand and to comprehend what death actually represents. What does death mean, and what impact does somebody else's death have on everyday life, and how can you kind of keep on living with the memory of someone very close to you who has died. It is absolutely all-consuming. It is constantly in his thoughts about his friend who has passed away. It is just not only an adoration of the person that friend had been, but it is also a new perspective on the people who are still around him and kind of how he moves through the world. It is fractured as much as thought is fractured, but it is also very clear, because it does represent that poignant moment when you do understand things completely differently than you did before, and they are a moment of clarity, and every single page, every single chapter within this just releases a new moment of clarity for you as a reader, in better understanding the world that you're also navigating around, but the world that this character is navigating through. There are so many wonderful homages to other writers, other books and other films that really represent how the author is inspired, but how the narrator is also inspired. and the role that art can play in particularly a creative person's life, and the way that literature influences others and can impact your perspective. Very much how this book kind of impacted my own reading experience and my own understanding of what literature really can be when it is written as well as this book is. If you may not tell already, this is definitely a 5-star read for me. I wanted to just read out a little bit towards the start, which I feel best represents the role that literature and film has in this text and the way that it is written, not in a pretentious way at all. It is delivered to us as is, and kind of we are left with an overwhelming sense of the meaning of that the author had in mind and the narrator subsequently wants to convey to you as a reader. It says, "I have always been haunted by the words of Montaigne, that to philosophize is to learn how to die, and that it is not death that is difficult, but dying. I am not a 16th century man, accustomed to epidemics, to wars, to the sudden and frequent loss of friends, parents and children, and for whom a 40-year-old is already an old man. But the books we read affect us with the intensity of a knife thrust into an organ without the survival prognosis. Almost each word that has been chosen for this book has been chosen for a very particular meaning, and each word is pregnant with the idea that the author is trying to get across to us, and every word that has been constructed into a sentence so perfectly placed with each other and creating these paragraphs of just very in-depth thoughts that kind of either mirror your own thoughts or enlighten you to new thoughts, are just like a treat. And each time you dip into this book, you are awarded so many more treats that I was absolutely fascinated by. And as I said, within this book there are lots of references to films and works of literature that exist outside of this book, and are then brought into it to kind of help to bolster a particular theme or a particular idea. A lot of them are ones that I had never heard of or had never read, or had never watched, so therefore you kind of feel a little bit, perhaps you're missing something, but you're not, because the narrator is sympathetic to a reader who perhaps hasn't had the same background that he has had, and therefore explains exactly what parts of that book or what parts of that film the narrator really enjoyed and what parts he is remembering in specific to the events that he is kind of working through, which helps you as somebody who doesn't recognise these names or these titles really understand the impact of what is trying to be said from these sort of references and these allusions. There's an absolute wonderful scene in this book where the narrator and his friend who is dying are within a cafe, and they see Milan Kundera is also there, and the friend is just in awe of this author and the way that Kundera's work really impacted his own life, and that whole sequence kind of truly represents what power literature can hold to somebody, and it really helps to instill the concept that the way that people create art and the stories that people tell are always telling a very human story that humans are just can absolutely latch onto and help to understand their own role in the world and their own role within the lives that they are leading out. So seeing how this character then reacted to seeing an author who he has admired, who has shaped his concept of existing so much, really helps us as a reader to kind of not only understand the importance of literature, but understand the importance of this book and the role that this book can then lead in our own lives, and reflecting on the ways that our stories have also been affected by the stories that other people have told, and the need that we do have to always philosophize about the meaning of life, and in the ways in which we can go about trying to find these meanings through either literature or through films or through pieces of art, or through any way that you personally find meaning. And I think that's just such a wonderful part of this book that really increases the depth that it reaches within you, and whilst you may not recognise all of the titles or some of the titles within this book, you are then able to kind of implant your own memories of special books within this story, and that allows you in a way to adopt the voice of the narrator as you also experience what the narrator is experiencing. I think in many ways you can see this book as a love letter. It is a love letter to a friend, to a lover, to anybody who is speaking. There's a very beautiful passage at the end of this book that I shall read out to you now. It says, "At the beginning of October 2015, as I was reading through the proofs of this book, I learned of the accidental death of Isabelle Collignon, who was a bookseller in Chamonix. I was deeply moved by this news. Isabelle loved her family and friends. She loved life, her beautiful valley and her mountains, the literature that she constantly stood up for. She was not able to read The Tree of the Toraja as I would have wished, but by way of affectionate homage, I should like her, whose sweet and unfailing smile I shall remember, to be welcomed into its pages." And so that gives you a sense of the kind of the love of this book represents. It can represent the love of a friend. There are also romances within this book that are teetering on the edges of the story and that help you to better understand the love that we feel through our lives for our partners, but the way that love changes as life goes on, and the way that life changes and changes that way or mode of loving, and how loving doesn't necessarily have to mean one thing. Love can evolve and can mean so many different things. And I think it just adds a very beautiful and a very human layer to this book. And I think as a reader, you can really feel that sense of love. So this book does also have a lot of, I guess, personal meaning to me. And in a way, that kind of sense of it being a love letter does have a lot of meaning, I guess, for me as a person, because it's actually almost 2 years ago, it'll be 2 years in September, that one of my best friends from secondary school passed away. And of course I was in Hong Kong at the time, and it was very strange because I happened to be in the UK when she had been told finally that her cancer was terminal and that she was going to die. So thankfully I had that moment where she had found out and had managed to tell me before I went back to Hong Kong, so I was able to see her before I went. And it was all like, it was a very strange kind of time, because you're saying goodbye to somebody who isn't dead yet, but you are saying goodbye to them because you know that's going to be the last time you're going to see them. So that was like a very tough time, and then being in Hong Kong when she did pass and having to miss the funeral was very difficult, as at the time I was 24, which is almost too young for any peer or for any friend to be passing away. I was left with this kind of sense that a 24-year-old is not immortal. A 24-year-old doesn't necessarily have a whole lifetime ahead of them. So I was very much put in the position that the narrator is put in within this, in which you are kind of coming to terms with your own mortality, whilst understanding the role that somebody very close to you has played within your life and is going to continue playing within your life. So I had a very similar journey, I guess, as the narrator had within this. But of course, it's all very personal, very unique, and it will be to absolutely everyone who goes through these sort of things. But I think this book allows itself to be a story of itself, yet also a story for the many people who experience these things. I think that also helped me to connect with this story in a way that kind of increased the poignancy of it. And I'm very thankful to have this book and to kind of reconfirm my own thoughts on life and of death that I've had, but through the eyes of somebody else. It was an experience reading this book, and it was a very powerful experience reading this book. And I think this book is going to stay with me for a long time. And I think as I progress through life and as things happen and change around me, this book is the sort of book that you can revisit and experience anew and see even more new perspectives from it, which I think is a very meaningful thing for a book to be able to do, and shows just what literature can do, and is one that I definitely urge lots of people to read. In the end, I had the illusion that there was a meaning to all of this, and that my life would become the film that I decided to make of it. I waited for years before owning a camera, a Super 8 Kodak which the father of a friend had sold me for next to nothing. But I did make films at a very early age. Basically, I'm convinced cinema can manage without camera, film and auditorium. Making films is deciding to rearrange those elements that surround us. It is choosing to tell a story in which you take part. It is a bit like taking over the controls for a while. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you next time for another one. Bye bye.